Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session for the GCSJ Research Festival. This one is organised by the OU Migration Group. As before, yes, the Q&A has been enabled, and please do feel free to post questions in there during the talk, and then we'll pick that up later on. Without any delay, I'll hand this over to Kate. Kate,
Okay,
please.
thank you, Gunjan. Hi, welcome. As Gunjan says, this is our first research panel, and it's been organised by myself and my colleague Catherine Median as coordinators of the Migration Group, which is a cross-disciplinary group which aims to bring researchers across the Open University who work on research on migration in various aspects. So our theme this morning is unsettling borders. And it's a broad theme, and the idea is to bring together researchers from across the OU whose research looks at migration, borders and boarding from diverse and interdisciplinary perspectives. So this panel is going to explore how world events such as climate change, political transformations, global war, conflict, etc., shape and reshape our perceptions of those who cross borders, and how borders affect the experiences and well-being of those on the move. So we're going to hear from Dr. Stacey Heath, who's going to talk about adaptation strategies and their impact on identity and on those who are displaced, and psychosocial borders of climate-related change. Unfortunately, Dr. Neil Graffin is unwell, so unfortunately we won't be able to hear about his research on port state control. But Dr. Sharif Haider is here, and he'll be talking about his research on decolonising mental health and innovations for supporting Rohingya refugees. Plenty of time for each speaker to speak. They'll be speaking for roughly 15 to 20 minutes, which should leave plenty for time for questions at the end. And as Gunjan was saying, please do use the Q&A to put your questions, and those will be sort of collated, and we'll address those at the end. So I'm going to hand over now to Stacey Heath to talk about her research.
Okay, great, thanks. So hello, I'm Stacey Heath, and yeah, I'm super pleased to be here today to talk to you a little bit about my research. So I am a social and environmental psychologist and a lecturer here at the Open University. My research sort of more broadly looks at how environmental changes, especially in terms of climate-related changes and the adaptations that they force, can undermine community identity, people's sense of belonging and attachment, and how those psychosocial disruptions can really impact health and well-being. In today's talk, then, I'm going to explore how climate-driven changes and adaptation strategies, so specifically looking at relocation as an adaptive strategy to climate change, can create new forms of displacement, so both literal and psychological, and what that means for the more sort of hidden borders of identity, anxiety and well-being. So I'm sure I don't need to convince anyone here that adaptations are absolutely and sadly increasingly necessary. Their primary objectives tend to focus on reducing risk and broader loss and damages sort of associated with loss of habitable land and infrastructure. And while we know that climate-related changes, including strategies of adaptation, can have both direct and indirect impacts that extend well beyond economic and physical risk, they are rarely incorporated into any processes of adaptation in any meaningful way. So adaptation strategies tend to really create an assumption of improvement on the daily life of at-risk communities based primarily on this drawdown of risk and economic factors. However, communities are not simply recipients of adaptation measures. They've got deeply ingrained social networks, shared identities, attachments to specific places and communities that are disrupted when these communities change. So adaptation interventions, and as I've said, specifically, we'll look at a case study of relocation, can cause immense disruption to both physical and psychosocial dimensions of communities, and especially where those changes are imposed. Failing to then acknowledge these consequences of change, particularly sort of the ways that individuals and groups identify with each other and their environment, can have really pervasive impacts on health and well-being. So, for example, when climate adaptation interventions reshape people's living conditions, social structures, and group-based dynamics, they can change long-standing networks of support and belonging. These psychosocial disruptions can lead to solastalgia, or sort of eco-grief and eco-anxiety, which are the feelings of grief and distress or dislocation. So people may literally lose a sense of who they are, whether through identity loss or disrupted routines. And that psychological distress can have knock-on effects for overall health and well-being. Importantly, these psychosocial harms can not only peak long after the change has occurred, they can be long-lasting and they can be enduring. And as ever, these sort of stresses are really amplified for those people who are most vulnerable to climate change to begin with. So people with pre-existing mental health difficulties, or communities that face compounded struggles like limited resources, infrastructural deficiencies, socio-political marginalizations, etc. So to try and develop understanding, or our understanding of some of these sort of broader impacts, we designed a survey to capture people's lived experiences of adaptations and how that really impacts their lives. The broader project then looks at the lived experiences of a variety of social measures and perceived impacts across different adaptation strategies internationally. As I've said, I'm going to focus specifically on a case study across two communities in the Volta Delta region of Ghana called Keta and Tope. And the study looks at the psychosocial implications then of relocation as an adaptive strategy to flooding. So a little bit of background: in Keta, the population has been resited away from the immediate risk of flooding. So it's been moved back across a road, back behind sort of their old community, across a road and into another purposely built community. But in Totope, so this is another location on the same area of the Volta Delta region, the community are still experiencing really high levels of inundation. They're anticipating a possible relocation, but they're pushing back against that. So far the community are challenging the relocation. They don't want to relocate. So this bespoke survey looked at multiple dimensions of well-being. So beyond those sort of usual economic measures, physical risk, it incorporated things like perceptions of safety, group-based identity, people's engagement, community engagement, etc., levels of support. And our findings overall really found that, at least for these communities, relocation had consequences for people's identity, their attachment, as well as their perceptions of safety, their anxiety, and their well-being. So essentially, while the relocation may have reduced the hazard vulnerability, it seemed to redistribute that risk as social vulnerability and into other sort of domains of their life. I've got a very short video clip that we developed as part of this project, and we have an online healthy adaptations hub that briefly talks through this case site, which sort of says it a little bit more visually, a little nicer than I can. So as I've said, there are limits to technical adaptation. Their primary objective is to reduce risk, but adaptation interventions both vary across scale, they have broader impacts, physical and material, and there are a lot of gaps, psychosocial gaps in our understanding of how these impacts both manifest and play out, and the consequences of those in the long term. As I've said, there's this kind of paradox of an adaptation process that can impact these psychosocial dimensions that are rarely integrated, and that they're multifaceted, very difficult to measure, often neglected and ignored as a consequence. This is the site that I thought I was showing to you here on my screen, but wasn't. So we looked at the project looked at hard engineering in Ireland, nature-based solutions in the UK, and then the managed retreat in Ghana. And I'm focusing specifically on the Ghanaian site. And now we'll get to the video, which hopefully I've at least said that you can please, if it doesn't come up, let me know. Help understand some of the ways that climate adaptations and relocation can impact people, a multinational team of researchers from the University of Ghana, Maynooth University, and the University of Exeter recently surveyed residents from both relocated and non-relocated coastal communities in Ghana. People living in the relocated area of Quetta reported that they felt more anxiety and felt much less safe than members of another community further along the same coastline called Totope, who have not been relocated. Residents from the village of Totope have not yet managed to relocate because the government could not provide them with a suitable location nor adequate funding to do so. Many of these community members are fishers, and it would take them a long time to get to the sea from the location that the government wants them to move to. There were also no funds available to build a community centre, a school, or a place of worship in the new location. These cases highlight the key elements that planners need to heed when it comes to climate adaptation. That is, understanding the potential for the well-being of people and communities to be affected through economic, social, environmental, and health impacts that can arise from the adaptation process. For example, in the case of Totope, ensuring continued access to livelihoods and community facilities will be crucial to the long-term resilience of the people living there. And you can only fully understand how communities are likely to be affected by listening to them and taking their views and experiences into account. This means that it is also key for the process of planning adaptations to include early and equitable engagement with individuals and communities. Doing so will ensure that there is a fully shared understanding around why a specific adaptation intervention must take place, what the needs of specific communities might be, and that the well-being of community members will not suffer as a result of the intervention. While every instance of climate change adaptation will be different depending on where in the world it is carried out, lessons from places like Ghana can be applied wherever decision makers are thinking about carrying out relocation or any other significant types of adaptation in response to climate-related change. So what you just saw in Quetta and Totope really illustrates that paradox. So even when relocation removes people from the immediate hazard, it often leaves them feeling unsafe, uprooted, and less connected to their friends, family, even livelihoods. So specifically, for Totope, there were no viable relocation options offered to the community. The idea for me that processes of adaptation don't consider the community's access to livelihood, wider social structures such as community and education spaces, are still being offered as pragmatic and realistic solutions to climate change is a real concern. And even where apparently adequate alternative community spaces have been sourced and the community has agreed and relocated, as seems to be the case with Quetta, the failure to include psychological understandings of how adaptation processes are experienced and manifest in the context of each specific community really undermines the community's overall well-being. So in the case of Quetta specifically, the community are now living in an area that feel unsafe, where they feel unsafe in and less attached to. Community members now find themselves doing this kind of seasonal dance where they leave the new relocated community when tides are low and return back to the previous, now becoming dilapidated community, which is closer to the coast, and then return back to the new relocated community again during the high tides. So we need to recognise that relocating communities has massive implications for social bonds and community structures, as well as people's sense of self and their connection to place. While we need to adapt, we do, we also need to build adaptations that last. We need to build adaptations that don't sow resentment or create mental distress or new conflicts. We need to build adaptation processes that integrate those psychosocial dimensions, such as intentionally rebuilding community trust or sustaining identity and repairing the damages to people's sense of who they are and where they belong. So making adaptation processes not just transformational, but transformative. And this is really important, because while we recognize the need for transformative adaptation, the integration of psychosocial or psychological, even sort of more broadly, but psychosocial dimensions are rarely explicitly acknowledged. Transformational, for those of you that any of you that don't know, as a brief overview, transformational adaptation typically refers to kind of the large scale structural interventions, new dikes, sea walls, levees, or even entire policy reforms, such as mandating that a certain coastal community must relocate. We're fundamentally changing the built environment or rewriting the policy book. That's what transformational adaptation is. Transformative adaptation, by contrast, it refers to these kind of deeper shifts in how a community sees itself, organizes social systems, reconfigures power relations. It's about asking, how do we rekindle shared purpose, rebuild identities, and co-design a future that really embodies equity, sustainability, well-being, resilience. It often involves sort of real participatory processes, new governance structures, or reworking cultural narratives around who we are and how we belong. And both of which are identified across the literature as necessary. And why do they both matter? But what's important is they both matter in conjunction. So if we only go transformational, if you only build a big flood barrier, but do so without recognizing that people have sacred sites behind where the barrier goes, or that fishing families have ancestral stories tied to that shoreline, you might shorten kind of the impacts of storms or flooding surges, but community trust and identity can be fractured, and that can have huge implications physically. It can produce exactly the kind of long-term anxiety, resentment, and resistance that we saw in Quetta. People will find ways to circumvent the barrier. So, for example, in Ireland, they've reduced a sea wall because it was seen as unsightly and dividing the community, because their psychosocial needs haven't been met and they're perhaps tied to that shoreline. On the other hand, if you focus entirely on transformative social processes without any physical shields and policy instruments, you risk leaving people exposed to immediate danger. So we need the big infrastructure and policy changes too, but we need to merge them both. We need to implement large-scale, justice-informed infrastructure or policy that simultaneously really engages communities in co-creating new social norms and governance and frameworks and cultural priorities. Essentially, we need transformational adaptation that incorporates psychosocial impacts, it incorporates that psychological understanding explicitly, and integrates it into both processes in practice, processes of adaptation, but also into processes of evaluation as well. And if you liked the little video, we do have another couple. So we have 3 videos, one for each of the sites at Ireland, the UK, and Ghana, on the Healthy Adaptations website there. So feel free to go over and have a look, and some of the literature that came out of that research as well. And thanks. That's me. And now I need to.
Right, I'll hand over to Neil. Thanks, Neil.
Hiya. So thanks very much to Stacey as well for that. I'd be interested to hear more about that actually afterwards. So today I'm going to speak a bit about my research, which is on port state control and assigning places of safety as mechanisms for controlling search and rescue vessels. This basically came out of research that we conducted and we're continuing to work on, where we're working with search and rescue workers who save the lives of people who make dangerous crossings. And we initially were seeking to understand how they navigate and understand the law, and also their legal knowledge, but we also wanted to get to understand how they feel impacted by the law when they're often subject to control and criminalisation. This will be the focus of this presentation, but I'll be focusing in on 2 kind of key themes to emerge from the research, because they've become the most predominant mechanisms of control of search and rescue vessels. So the two key areas that I want to focus on are on port state control and assigning places of safety for vessels. So that's when they've rescued people and they're finding a port of safety. What often happens with search and rescue vessels is that they are detained by port state control in whatever state they might land in, whether it's Spain, Malta, Italy, whatever it might be. Flag states have the primary responsibility for safeguarding against what are substandard ships, which is basically what port state control is looking at, that are unsafe or could pollute the environment. Port state control, however, also provides a mechanism to control vessels through the Paris Memorandum of Understanding. What that means is when a ship comes into a port, they're often put through an inspection regime, and the following types of inspection can be carried out: initial inspection, a more detailed inspection, and an expanded inspection. And this will become more evident as we go through as to why this is important. So initial inspection generally checks the certificates and documents listed in Annex 10 of the Memorandum of Understanding text, and I'll go through that a wee bit in a moment. It checks the overall condition and hygiene of the ship, including the navigation bridge, accommodation and galley, decks, including forecastle, cargo hold areas, etc., etc., to make sure that they meet international rules and standards. And if there's been any previous deficiencies, it will want to check that they've been rectified or there's no kind of follow-up issues with respect to those. A more detailed inspection will be carried out when there are clear grounds of believing that the condition of the ship or its equipment does not substantially meet the relevant requirements of the relevant instrument. This basically means if they find something in the first inspection that requires them to think that there could be further issues, they'll put it through a more detailed inspection. Clear grounds exist when a PSC officer finds evidence which, in his or her professional judgment, warrants a more detailed inspection of its ship, its crew, its equipment, or its crew. High-risk ships and ships of a risk type, including chemical tankers, gas carriers, oil tankers, NLS tankers, bulk carriers, and passenger ships, and those of more than 12 years old are eligible for an expanded inspection. This is all quite dry stuff at the moment, I do understand, but it will become more interesting as we kind of get through. An expanded inspection will look at the structural conditions of a ship, whether it's water type, emergency systems, radio comms, fire safety systems, alarms, living and working conditions, life-saving appliances, and pollution prevention measures. So these are the types of things that you might find under Annex 10, and there's 85 items. Now, not all of these will actually apply to every ship, but I just thought it might be a good idea to kind of give you a bit of an idea. If you look up the PSC checklist or you look up Annex 10, you'll see how complicated a regime it actually is to run a ship in terms of meeting its health and safety requirements or in terms of meeting its pollution requirements. There's lots of certificates needed, lots of various things that relate to, as we have here, passenger ship safety certificate, international tonnage certificate, all of this type of stuff. I've just taken excerpts. I know this is quite small, so apologies for that, but you've got fire control plan, fire safety operational booklet. As we go further down, you've got garbage management plans, garbage record booklets, international air pollution prevention certificates, etc., etc. And there's 85 of these types of certificates. Again, not all of them will apply. Some will apply to oil tankers, for example, only, but it still gives a picture of how complicated a regime this will be. And this is kind of what they check as a minimum that they meet, that they have these sort of certificates. It then goes into more detailed examination of the actual ship itself in terms of what is it that how do they meet the various sort of requirements with regards to sewage, for example, or fire safety, or all of these different things. So what I've suggested at the start is that search and rescue vessels are subject to control through PSC, and what they do is they use this very complicated sort of procedure, and they find things that they can detain vessels for. There have been a number of court cases pushing back on the detention of specific ships. In this particular case, Sea-Watch, I'm not trying to pronounce the Italian, but the Sea-Watch EV, they considered whether port state control should actually be subjected to vessels performing search and rescue. and if a Sea-Watch vessel, this particular Sea-Watch vessel in this case, had been detained illegally for inspection. So port state control had until quite recently only applied to commercial vessels. It's more recently been expanded out to fishing vessels. So there was a question whether it should actually be applied to search and rescue vessels. So that was part of this particular case. In this case, the defendants, the harbour masters, contended that the vessel in question was not certified to conduct search and rescue. It had taken on greater numbers than it was able to accommodate, basically because it was rescuing hundreds of people at sea. And there were technical deficiencies giving rise to health and safety and the environment, making detention of the ship necessary. On the other hand, Sea-Watch claimed that the harbour masters had exceeded their powers as derived from a specific directive of the EU in detaining the ship for inspection. What was found in this case is that on the subject of whether port state control should be subjected to vessels performing SAR, it held that it can be after assistance has been rendered. So it confirmed that particular question. But the court also specified that to do so, the port state must demonstrate that there are serious indications of danger to health and safety, onboard working conditions, or the environment. And the port state has powers to adopt corrective measures, but they must be suitable, necessary, and proportionate. But what we found in our research, now a lot of our findings actually predated this case. It'll be interesting to find out in what is going to be our next piece of research, which focuses on this in much more depth, is that a lot of these things aren't being, a lot of this requirement of seriousness, for example, isn't actually being met. The participants themselves contended that they're operating in a space that calls for emergency measures, but in their view, they're asked to comply with additional measures that the other vessels have, that go beyond what other vessels have to comply with. So we get it in this comment here. No other ship that performs or should perform rescues like the Italian Coast Guard, Maltese Coast Guard, Spanish Coast Guard, military ships, nobody is being requested about this. I mean, when you rescue people in the sea, everyone assumes it's an emergency situation, and since you're not a ferry or anything like that, you shouldn't have to comply with all of that stuff. What we also seen is that inspections were being conducted routinely, regardless, in the view of participants, of need. It's systematic for us to have port state control when we disembark people in Italy, and this kind of control by the state never happened each time the commercial ships touch the ground in any country of the world. This person was a commercial farer as well. When I navigate a commercial ship as a seafarer, I did not expect and fear port state control each time I go out to port. The regulations seem to be the same for everyone, but for us SAR vessels, it is really, really more. As I said, the Sea-Watch case indicates this need for serious indications of a danger to health and safety, onboard working conditions of an environment. But a lot of the stuff that was being discussed seemed quite frivolous. So examples of non-compliance discussed by participants included finding that items were out of date. This included maps, in one example by a week, where the maps were of lighthouses. So as you can imagine, not probably needing that much updating. Physical copies of navigation charts were up-to-date, digital charts were being used anyway. Pyrotechnics or fire extinguishers, and other examples included stickers not being in items or having too many life jackets on board. So this person says, so really quite ridiculous. Another example, per sewage facilities, which as we get in this comment here, they were concerned about the well-being of rescued people in terms of sewage facilities. We are talking about people who we were rescuing from the immediate risk of drowning. And then you held these people at sea for almost 2 weeks after the event. So these people were held in quarantine. This was during COVID. And now you're concerned that when they're on board, maybe they won't have sufficient hygiene facilities. The level of hypocrisy, it just blows your mind. This second comment here from interview 13 is a bit more charitable. It said, if you've got a 1940s fishing trawler going out to provide a sea rescue, it's got to be fit for purpose. And if your sole purpose is to go out and save 300-400 people, you've got to have the right sewage systems. You've got to have X amount of toilets because you have to provide for these people and provide them dignity. And you also have to comply with that legislation, whether you like it or not. But this person did also note that port state control were going well beyond the remit anyway. What I should have actually said earlier, a lot of the search and rescue vessels have been used for many years, so they might fall under the auspices of port state control a bit more because they're quite old. They're offshore vessels, supply vessels that are dating back. Some of their kind of construction dates are like the 60s or 70s. This person's talking about a 40s fishing trawler, so really quite old ships.
Neil, sorry to interrupt, but if you could wrap it up fairly soon.
Yes, I'll maybe skip the next page. The other big issue at the minute, just to say in relation to the Mediterranean, is assigning places of safety. I'll skip this. I'll just skip the legal stuff in relation to this, but it's basically just to say that you do places of safety are recommended at the point of where the destination point were at disembarkation by the IMO, but it's not actually strict law, and states use this as a loophole to assign places of safety elsewhere or to hold people whilst they're waiting for them to be assigned safety. I was going to speak a bit about this in terms of our research, but maybe just to kind of skip that and say the predominant thing that's really happening at the minute on top of port state control is that the Italian government are assigning places of safety way far away from effectively where people are rescued. So people are have a pointer here. Most rescues are taking place in this kind of zone here between Libya and Sicily in relation to people traveling across the water here. Sorry, maybe here. But they're assigning places of safety all around here. These are the ports. Like, so what's happening is ships are having to expend fuel, they're having to expend time, and they're having to expend money to try and get to these particular ports. That is only to disrupt our organizations. There's no other reason for that. That's only to make it harder for them. So that is, just creating difficulties for the sake of it, because the migrants are going to enter the Italian state anyway. So just to conclude, the control of vessels through administrative control is now the predominant mode that goes beyond. It's gone beyond criminalisation now, and it's now about administrative control. It's now the predominant mode to disrupt our organisations. Port state control and the Maritime Rescue Coordination Centre in Italy, for example, abuse existing law and regulation, which is often complex to disrupt the work of SOR organisations. But we are seeing counter strategies. We are seeing the likes of SOS Humanity, Sea-Watch, and others having success in appealing the detention of ships. And there's currently action being undertaken to against the distance ports policy. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Neil. And particularly as I know you're not feeling great, so I really appreciate you presenting that. Sharif, are you still there? Thanks for your patience. If you would like to do your presentation.
A little bit of issues with my computer because the Windows 11, but I'm getting there. So this project is based in Bangladesh, and the region is Cox's Bazar, where 1.5 million Rohingya refugees moved from Myanmar to Bangladesh. And this project, funded by Novo Nordisk and Welcome Fund, and the project is basically focusing on decolonizing mental health. Lots of discussion, as you know, we want to decolonize lots of things. Mental health is one of them. But we don't know how to do it. And this project is all about finding out how we can do it with people who are marginalized, voiceless for a long time. And the project funded actually, the way this fund operates is they gave us first stage fund to do something, to start with initial study, and then the plan is actually when I submit this, they will actually see whether this this project will have enough to get second stage fund. So this is actually what I'm sharing with you today is first stage. Okay, lots of data. We are currently analyzing the data. So I will be able to share a few things from the data, but not much because still we are analyzing the data. The partners of these projects, of course, we are the lead partner from the UK, and then we've got partners from Bangladesh University, Dhaka University, Shah Jalal University, and of course we've got grassroots level organizations. They are actually working with us. So the objective, the first stage, we try to understand Rohingya people's understanding of mental health. When we say mental health, what does it mean to them? How they define mental health? And then exploring their help-seeking behavior. The issue with Rohingya people, because they've been, I think, it's actually the United Nations has very recently described the Rohingya as the most persecuted minority in the world. So we wanted to know that they are actually experiencing mental health for a long time. But the thing is, actually, we know that based on our theoretical understanding of mental health. But how that actually impact on them, how they actually see the mental health and how they seek the support for mental health. What kind of support system exists in Rohingya camps? There are about 34 Rohingya camps in 33 in Cox's Bazar, which is the south part of Bangladesh, and one in a little island called Vashan Chor. So that was the first stage that we wanted to see. So what we did, how we actually got the data. So we did about talking circles. So it's like a kind of focus group roundtable discussion, but it's actually using the decolonization lens, decolonization methodology. And we had about 6 talking circle with the Rohingya people. And the other thing you need to bear in mind that in Bangladesh, Rohingya are not treated as refugee because Bangladeshi government never signed the treaty, refugee treaty. Therefore, they cannot actually call them Rohingya refugee. They are basically stateless. And then what we did after talking with talking circles with Rohingya adults, we also took with the NGO and INGOs workers to understand what kind of mental health support available to this group of people, and then we did a policy making discussion. So that's what we did. So in total, about I think in 6 talking circles, we had about 60 Rohingya adults, and in relation to NGOs and INGOs, those we focused on psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health workers, counselors, and we had about 30 practitioners. And then we did policy discussion, and we had about 50 service developers and policymakers from Bangladesh. Now, before I actually share the findings, I would like to share a video with you. I'm not sure whether that's going to work, but let me try to see whether I can actually share a video with you. Can you see video?
Yes, I can see something.
Oh, good. Oh, thank you.
Could you just make sure, Sharif, that the audio, you're also sharing the audio? There's a button on
Yeah.
top of the screen. Just make sure it's clicked.
I think I clicked that one, so I will. It's not long. It's
Okay,
about 3 to 4 minutes. Yeah, I tick that box to ensure that you hear all the noises. So what I'm going to share you now is the fastest stage of the project, what we did, giving you the visual picture of the camps, Rohingya adults, Rohingya people, and their daily routines, basically, how they live, how they do things in the camps. Before I show you, the other thing you need to bear in mind, these camps are pretty restricted. They are not allowed to use mobile phones or internet, and they're not allowed to move out of the camp, even because those camps are because especially the 33 camps which are located in Cox's Bazar, to move from one camp to another camp, they need permission from the Bangladeshi government, and families are not living in one camp. They basically scattered in different camps. So now I'm going to share the video with you. I hope you can hear.
Yes.
Right, thank you very much. So that's actually the video of our fastest stage doing the project and giving you some idea about the camp. So I'll just give you very brief findings very briefly. In relation to understanding of mental health, what we found in the first stage is that the way we see mental health from the psychiatrist's point of view is totally different the way the Rohingya people see mental health. Generally, we divide mental health and physical health, mind and body, we separate the two. They don't. Rather, they actually bring another elements to it, where it's not just mind, a body, but also soul in it. And that actually then changed the whole understanding of mental health. So the support system which are currently exist in 34 camps are mostly focusing on psychosocial support by the psychologists, psychiatrists, and counselors. Now, those support mechanism or those support services are heavily reliant on Western understanding of mental health. But if their understanding of mental health is different, which we found, then surely whatever they're doing is not working, and that's exactly what we found. For example, to give you one of the Rohingya adults said to us in one of the talking circles, the question was, how are things with them, because they actually experience quite a lot in relation to trauma, resettlement, stressor in Bangladesh before coming to Bangladesh. So all this trauma, stress, anxiety, how that's actually impacting on them and how they're managing it, how they're coping, and the mechanism in place, whether they're actually helping them. And he said to us that I just finished my counseling session with one of the counselor, and I then actually asked to him, how did it go? How you found it? And he said to me, you know what, it is, I'm going to using his quote now, it was bloody painful. It was absolutely waste of my time, unquote. So that was actually from one of the Rohingya adults about the counseling, and the counselor who actually provided the session using CBT, which is cognitive behavior therapy. And he's not, you know, just the one voice. The 60 Rohingya adults, we talked, we try to explore their understanding, and we found similar kind of stories. Therefore, what is happening is the psychosocial support, the amount of money invested in Rohingya camps, based on our fastest stage, we do not think that's actually helping people. Therefore, we see the aftermath, that means actually consequences of mental health, which is actually manifest to maladaptive behavior like gambling, smoking, heavily smoking, engaging in loads of, you know, women, child trafficking, kidnapping, you know, taking drugs, conflict within the camp, sort of fighting, people setting fire to, you know, those makeshift houses, stealing, robbing. So those are basically the consequences of not managing mental health. That's what we actually found. In relation
sorry
to
interrupt, Sharif, if you could wrap it up fairly soon.
Out of time. Okay. So,
well, just very quickly.
Okay, so, and also the other thing, I'm not sharing that slide with you because still we are analyzing the data, but what we found, Rohingya people very much rely on their cultural and religious understanding and needs. They very much rely on their religion, their culture, everything what they do is actually shaped by their religion and culture. And the religion and culture are actually distinctive. Even 99% of Rohingya people are Muslim, but their understanding of Islam and even the host community's understanding of Islam is actually different. And they heavily rely on community healers, they call them Boito, and they also rely on the religious leaders. And another reason why the psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals, including counselors, are unable to engage Rohingya adults in terms of managing their mental health needs. So this, in a nutshell, the first stage of our findings. We hope that we get the second stage fund to do this project for next 4 years, and the plan is actually based on our initial understanding. We develop some principle out of the decolonizing lens of thinking. Hopefully that would actually enable us to develop a different kind of support system, support mechanism, services for Rohingya adults, and that's going to be innovative than what is actually provided. We still do not know how the decolonizing mental health is going to look like. Hopefully this research would answer or shed some light on this matter. And because that the support system or mechanism that we are planning to develop that's going to come out of Rohingya people, which hopefully would be more sustainable, because that's actually going to be embedded in their culture, religion, and indigenous practice. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Sharif. That's another fantastic presentation.